All right. So today I want to quickly reiterate on why we are learning about functional programming in this class at all. Why should we care about FRP and what's wrong with MVC? So in the very first lecture, I already had a slide that explained what was wrong with MVC, so you can refer back to that one if you like. And in this video, I quickly want to lay out a couple of reasons why we are learning about FRP. And the very short answer is that we are writing better software with FRP. And better software just means it's safer, it has less bugs, it's faster to write, and it has all these qualities that we are striving for when we are building software in general. So the first point is that the code will actually be simpler than with an architecture such as MVC. And the reason for that is that we have less programming concepts to take care of, less programming concepts to learn, and we are using a coherent programming model when we are using FRP. So what does this mean? Why do we have a lot of different programming concepts that we need to learn when we're building apps with MVC? Well, if you consider how we are building apps with MVC, we have a lot of different communication patterns, and we learned about all of them in the last lesson. In the last class, in the last quarter, where we learned about delegates, we learned about closures, we learned about KVO and its notification center, all these different programming concepts that we somehow need to bring together to build one application. And we have to figure out when to use which programming concept, which is appropriate. Then we have to make sure that they interact well one with another. But we really have to make sure that all these different communication patterns interact together and form one application in the end. And that's quite a complex task. So with an FRP library, we only have one programming model, and that is in the programming library that we've been using so far, which is RxSwift. There it has been the concept of an observable. And once you understand what an observable is and how it works, you'll be able to understand everything about the whole FRP approach, because basically everything that follows will only be slight variations of what you already know. Further, we usually write less code when we're writing FRP apps. And the reason for that is that we have less instructions to take care of. It's actually interesting, and I'm going to show you an example in the next video where I refer back to the very first project that we were working on, the greeting generator, and show you how the FRP approach leads to notably less code when we want to implement the same functionality. And then, as I mentioned just in the beginning, it also leads to safer code. So we are actually going to write less bugs when we are using FRP, and that's because we cannot neglect accidentally any failure scenarios. And the most common source of errors when we are building apps with the MVC architecture, for example, is that we somehow, as developers, as programmers, we're lazy and we don't care about the case inside our application when things go wrong, when a network request actually fails with some kind of problem that we don't expect. This is very, very easy to neglect when we're using MVC, but when we're using an FRP library, this is just not possible. The library, the compiler, they are there to help us, and they will enforce that we don't neglect these scenarios, but rather take care of them explicitly, and that's what makes the code safer overall. And then one very, very important point as well is the fact when we are writing a code with a program with an FRP library, we are writing declarative code. What does this mean? So declarative, the word basically means that we're describing something, right? And the whole goal here is that we're describing what we want the computer to do, and we are not telling it how we want the computer to do what we want. So this is actually a very important distinction between declarative and imperative code. Imperative code means we give detailed instructions to the computer as to how it has to accomplish a certain task. Whereas when we are writing declarative code, we're telling it what we want to do, and the computer can figure out by itself how it's supposed to do that. A very good example for a declarative API on iOS is auto layout. Before auto layout was introduced, we always had to specify the frame values for UI views directly by setting the X, the Y, the width, and the height on any view that we wanted to appear on the screen. Since auto layout has been introduced, and auto layout uses a declarative API where we specify rules, these rules are called constraints, if you recall. These rules, they declare what the user interface should look like in the end, and then auto layout, the auto layout system, the code inside the auto layout framework is going to calculate and set the actual frame values for us. So here again, we're using a declarative API, and declarative APIs are always preferable over imperative APIs. And a good analogy from the real world about this would be that say you wanted your roommate to bring you some groceries from the supermarket. In this case, you really wouldn't want to explain to your roommate that the roommate should first go to the supermarket and how it should go there, and then to which part of the supermarket it should go. You really only want to specify what are the things that your roommate should bring for you from the supermarket, rather than having to explain every detailed step, every little step that your roommate needs to do in order to get the groceries for you. And then last but not least, FRP is a very, very popular programming paradigm at the moment, and it's rising and rising, and it's becoming more and more popular. You can see that in the web development world as well, for example, where the framework called React also follows a similar approach and also uses functional reactive programming principles and has become the de facto standard in web development. And in the Swift world, FRP has become very, very popular as well, and you can actually prove that to yourself by checking out the FRP libraries on GitHub and see the number of stars they have, or by referring to recent conferences and checking what kind of talks are being given there. And most of these talks will be about functional or functional reactive programming. And that is just because of all the advantages that you see on the slide that I mentioned and explained before.